Boa tarde a todos. Vamos dar início, então, ao nosso quarto painel, Green Future and Sharing Civilization Between China and Latin America. Eu queria começar apresentando os palestrantes. Mônica Gabay, co-coordenadora do IUFRJ, Divisão 9, e professora da Universidade Nacional de São Martín, na Argentina. Vélia Govare, ex-vice-ministra da Economia, Indústria e Comércio da Costa Rica e professora da UNED. Leonardo Bularmarque, da Escola Brasileira de Estudos Avançados. Jansen Martins Lopes, gerente de Pesquisa, Desenvolvimento e Inovação e Novas Energias da Petrobras. E Zheng Bingjian, espero que tenha pronunciado corretamente, diretor da University Outreach Office da Universidade de Hanyang. Com isso, eu gostaria de passar já a palavra para Mônica Gabay e vamos tentar manter no tempo cerca de entre 10 e 15 minutos para a gente conseguir terminar o evento razoavelmente no horário previsto. Obrigado.
Obrigada. Boa tarde. Meu portunhol é muito ruim, assim que vou falar inglês. So, good afternoon to everybody, and thank you for being here for this last session. It's difficult to endure a whole day of people talking about these complex topics. So, today I'm going to talk about producing in harmony with nature, and I'm going to showcase some tools and policy instruments in what little time we have. So, an overview is that I will say something about the NBSAP, so our National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan. And then I will show a couple of instruments we are using to achieve that. So without much ado, let's jump into it. So first thing is I wish to recall what Mrs. Aspasia mentioned this morning about the divide between developing countries and developed countries. And unfortunately, this divide continues. In spite of our best efforts to bridge those differences, we still cannot do it. And you see here the Kunming Global Biodiversity Framework, and I wish to praise the Chinese presidency for navigating us with a success through these very difficult times of the pandemic. And this was a very difficult negotiation. I was part of it. And the discussions show that we had very, very opposing worldviews, whereas us developing countries were thinking about social inclusion, poverty, and the challenges we face. Developed countries were thinking about overconsumption. And I was trying to explain to my colleagues, how can I discuss overconsumption when about 2/3 of the children in my country are below the poverty line? Overconsumption is not a thing that we need to think of. And yet, developed countries are free riding on our resources. And when we ask for support for the means of implementation, they discuss and they say they shouldn't give us anything. But the biodiversity is in our countries, in our regions, and we are the ones that are supporting their livelihoods. Without us, without our production, they would just not be able to function. And one example is rare earths, and China is in this discussion. Another example is food and food security. Latin America produces about 19.2% of the world's exports of food. And during the pandemic, we were substantial to keep the world well fed in a challenging time. And this effort is not being recognized. Our right to development is not being considered. And we have strived for that, and we achieved a very important Section C in the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, which I invite you to read, because it enshrines the diversity, the multiculturalism, the right to development, the Rios Declaration principles, the national priorities and circumstances and capacities. It was a huge strive to achieve this. So I invite you to check and to remember. So Argentina is also very diverse. We have 18 ecoregions. I'm not going into that because I am told I have little time. But I wish to showcase a bit of our governance system for biodiversity. We have a national commission that was created the moment Argentina ratified the CBD, and it encompasses most sectors of our society, including trade unions, which are not usually mentioned, but they are part of this scheme because we are discussing producing in harmony with nature, and the trade unions are part of the production, not only the private sector, but the workers, the indigenous peoples and local communities, academia, public sector. We all have a role to play, professional associations. So I don't know how to hide this toolbar, but I wish to show you the 9 strategic axes of our strategy. And I'm not going to discuss that in detail, but I just wish to mention some core ideas. First of all, the priority on preserving biodiversity, but preserving in the way of conserving not intangibly, but sustainably using it. Because our communities need livelihoods. We need more inclusion. We need a good standard of living in harmony with nature, with people inside, because we are part of nature. Although Western civilization sometimes forgets we are part of nature. Encompassing the diverse knowledge systems, so both traditional knowledge and Western science and evidence-based policies are part of the same system, and they are complementary. They are not opposite. The solidarity and cooperation among sectors inside the countries, between regions and in the world, in line with the SDG 17. The values of biodiversity, the need to visualize the value of ecosystem services that has been discussed today. So now into producing in harmony with nature. Of course, we are very eager to achieve these ends, and Argentina is very reliant on its agricultural exports. And we are one of the world's top producers and exporters of lemons, of beans, of corn, of soy meal and soy oil, and so many other food commodities. I bring you today 2 examples on how we can face the challenges and the trade barriers that some of our trade partners have produced, like the EUDR regulation. Of course, we are in favor of deforestation-free production, as my colleague Lucas showed this morning. And we believe we have a system that's interesting, and it offers traceability of soybean production and of beef production. It's called the VSEC. It's a sectoral vision for the Great Chaco region that's shared between Argentina, Bolivia, and Paraguay, and we have about 60% of that area. And very briefly, we have protocols to register each plot. That means we have the traceability of the crops from the plot into the ship, with a digital platform, with intervention of government agencies like the Registry for Sanitation for our producers and our Internal Revenue Service that have a record of this, and there's a way of, with a geographical information system to have the coordinates of where the soybean comes from, and with teledetection systems and satellite images check whether there has been deforestation or not associated with that production, with a baseline in December 31, 2020. And we have third-party certifications with annual verifications of the chain of custody of these products until it's shipped and out in trip for Europe. So we have this system. I only have 2 minutes for my 10 minutes, so I'm jumping to certified sustainable agriculture. That's a standard by the Zero Tillage Producers Association. Very interesting one, with over 100,000 hectares already certified for resilient agriculture, with optional accountability for carbon sequestration. And a new standard that's integrated into this, which I am not going to discuss, which is specifically of resilient agriculture. We have the Rainforest Alliance and many organizations working together in those two schemes I'm showing. It's very simple. The farmer registers. There has some protocols. They can have some support. The government offers capacity buildings for small, medium enterprises, and this is also possible for this standard. And implementation can have some technical advice. They have external audits, and then they produce a certification, and they need to recertify every 3 years with an annual follow-up. So I showed you the impact, the carbon footprint option, and the competitiveness. And some final thoughts on my last 30 seconds. First of all, I think it's very important to bear in mind that governance is key. We have been discussing governance a lot today, but it's not overabundant to say that we need every sector involved. Everybody should be on board in these discussions because this is a whole of society approach. And it has to bear in mind that in federal countries like Brazil and Argentina, I'm sure China has a similar system from what I heard today, although I confess I'm very ignorant. You need local governments and provincial governments involved because it's their resources and in the end it's their responsibility to have things done and laws implemented. And these market-based instruments that also include the public-private partnership are probably a good way forward in contrast with command and control policy instruments that are very expensive, very difficult to control, and very difficult to really have them correctly implemented because the state, at least in my country, simply doesn't have the means to control everything everywhere in 3 million million square kilometers. That's the area of my country, Brazil, is even larger. So maybe voluntary schemes are a way to go. So thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you, Monica. So I'm just going to pass along to the next speaker, Ms. Velia Covarelli, please.
Thank you very much. I'm going to share with you some thoughts about China's ethical light on the Latin American path to a new era. Since colonial times, Latin America has been filled with pain. Eduardo Galeano recounted what he called the open veins of Latin America. The European colonialists arrived with the Bible in one hand and the Souther in the other. Ideologies were always offered as rationalization for subjugation. Encomienda was the Spanish name for a barbaric exchange, where the indigenous population surrendered their freedom in exchange for accepting the culture of the Catholic faith. Religious ideology in return for slavery. In its cultural history, Latin America has never experienced respite at the arrival of a culture from overseas, until China arrived. Colonial oppression, as Galeano rightly said, left open wounds and other forms of national humiliation replaced independence with neo-colonialism. From oppressive colonial structures emerged oligarchies sustained by dictatorships. Abandonment, disease, hunger, and inequality continue to run in these open veins. The fall of the Berlin Wall and the overcoming of a world divided into blocks allowed Latin America to move towards generally democratic political forms. In addition, globalization opened up a bubble of opportunities to overcome social contradictions and productive gaps. These conditions of an interconnected world without ideological barriers meant in the last 30 years the best period of political stability, economic growth, and fight against poverty and inequality in the history of Latin America. However, The reality of the situation is that the nations of Latin America are still far below their potential, separated even within their national borders by geographical barriers and poor infrastructure. They were not able to take advantage of their enormous resources, shared language, and cultural unity to promote comprehensive economic development, until China came along. In this context, the trade with the People's Republic of China played a stellar role, especially in the southern corner of the subcontinent, where the extractive industry and the massive production of agricultural raw materials prevailed. From Argentina and Uruguay to Chile and Brazil, as well as Peru, Ecuador, and Venezuela, the sustained growth of the Chinese economy meant a permanent flow of resources derived from its ever-growing demand for commodities and a systemic source of investments. Over and above the immense commercial, financial, and infrastructure development advantages that came with China's civilizing encounter with the American subcontinent, our Latin American countries discovered, perhaps for the first time in their history, the full respect for their political forms and traditions that flowed from China's millenary harmony based on relations of reciprocal benefit. This relationship created business opportunities, diversified the origin and destination of Latin American trade, and mitigated the commercial dependence on its traditional markets, North America and Europe. This is true, and yet it does not account for all the cultural significance that accompanied China's encounter with Latin American histories. Because the profound significance of such an experience is not confined to the economic aspects, because in the long run, nothing is more important in the history of nations than their discovery that another culture comes to share their dreams without the desire to dominate. In this context, Latin American prospects for progress were enhanced with the announcement of the Belt and Road Initiative in 2013, which heralded new international financing system and a whole program of investment in physical infrastructure and connectivity in connection with the unmet needs of a continent physically disconnected by numerous geographical obstacles. It is in this promising context that took place the defining events of a dangerous but possible change of era, as former German Chancellor Olaf Scholz put it. Scholz called it a fundamental turning point of the era, underlining the end of unipolar hegemony. In China, in a more positive way, President Xi Jinping called it a new era, a promising context of opportunities, also filled with the inevitable risk associated with change. History never walks a straight line. The dialectic of progress is always accompanied by vested interests that feel themselves challenged, and the return to the past remains a permanent threat. The war in Ukraine brings to light the inherent dangers of a confrontation with unpredictable consequences. The same dark prospects are manifest in the latest calamities in the Middle East. Absurd tariff wars undermine the multilateral trading system and turn what was once an exchange that united the worlds in value chains into a confrontation that divides. These are the sunset aspects of a world that is slow to die. An internationally conducive period for progress is coming to an end. Another is just beginning. The image of the sunset of civilization comes to us from the great Italian communist leader Antonio Gramsci, who warned that the old war was in agony, while the new one was slow to be born, and that it was in that very chiaroscuro that monsters arise. But it is not all shadows. On planet Earth, the dawn also breaks when the night is at its darkest. It is the other side of the coin of the decline of one era, the rise of another, which I think is what President Xi Jinping is referring to when he announces a new era. Unfortunately, Latin America countries did not know how to take full advantage of the democratic bonus, and the commercial bonanza of that period did not translate into the overcoming of their structural problems. These shortcomings in the fulfillment of the democratic promises resulted in acute and widespread political instability. Almost all countries have fallen into a duality of their productive system. In each country, there are gaps, imbalances, asymmetries, but also all the potential offered by a continent culturally twinned by native traditions and the vocation of an unfulfilled unity left by the colonial past. But among multiple cultural and political aspects that divide the people of Latin America, a great weight of our division and our undeveloped capacities is based on the physical continental disconnection. Hence, the physical connection of an infrastructure that does not yet exist would bring us together to each other, and by connecting the two seas that bathe our coasts, would open the Pacific route to the people bathed by the Atlantic, and for all of us, it will also open doors to China. Although very briefly, I would like to outline some particularly representative countries. In South America, Chile is an emblematic paradigm where progress cohabits with social and economic asymmetries. Chile is a very important and willing partner of China. Its extractive and agricultural complementarity with China has been linked to the awareness of the Chilean ruling class to take advantage of this relationship to cement the added value of its exports and receive support in the creation of its own technological capabilities. Its president, Gabriel Boric, has recently said, referring to the relationship model with the Chinese companies that won the bidding for lithium extraction under preferential conditions, and I quote, "We are not going to limit ourselves only to the extraction of non-metallic minerals, but we are also going to create value chains and transfer knowledge," end of quote. This Chilean position fully corresponds to China's approach to share benefit exchange with its partners. Brazil is another illustration of the complementarity of its trade and investment relation with China. Since 2003, relations with China have been boosted with the coming into power of Ignacio Lula da Silva. During those years, Brazil has proven the capacity of a country to massively reduce poverty. Leveraged with resources from trade with China, which became its main trading partner, it manages to lift 20 million people out of poverty and improved substantially its health and educational levels. Along with China, since 2009, Brazil is a founding member of the BRICS, original just BRIC. With Lula returned into power in 2023, Brazil became more geopolitically involved in international processes as a strategic partner of China. The relationship between Brazil and China is a decisive component of the new era, and both countries are involved in promoting world peace. Peru is, in the region, a case of extreme political instability, but that, however, has not prevented the deepening of its relation with China. It is one of the two South American countries that, together with Chile, has a free trade agreement with China and has boldly assumed the opportunities offered by the Belt and Road Initiative. With a Chinese investment of more than $3 billion US, the Shanxi megaport has become the flagship of Chinese investment in the whole region, as it will position Peru as the main entry point for products from Asia and will turn the country into a major hub for the entire region. I will end by talking about my country, Costa Rica, a small country, but emblematic of the destinies that the continent would like to see. It is indeed a very small country, and its circumstances would not seem at first sight relevant to the Latin American reality. This is a false assessment. The crisis of political representation in Costa Rica is extremely relevant because Costa Rica is one of the most resilient democracies in the region. And yet, the international reality imposes itself. And I must confess that Costa Rica is walking the dismal path of the crisis of political representation of the rest of Latin America. This is important. Without political representation, democracy is a mockery, a true ideological fabrication. That is why it is decisive to understand how Costa Rica was naturally the first Central American nation to establish diplomatic ties with the People's Republic. It was also the first in this region to establish a free trade agreement with China. Also, and this is sad and dangerous, it is in the middle of all that entails the commercial and technological confrontation between the United States and China. Hence, Costa Rica finds itself between conflicting currents, and the opportunity of its participation in the Belt and Road Initiative opens a space for it to set the course of its national interest above pressures. Will it do so? This is the dilemma that other Latin American countries also face, to decide their own narrative. Nothing simple in the current context, but it is a real challenge, which in the end will be determined by the synthesis of two opposing signs: the understanding of the transcendence of being in a new era and the acquired reflexes of the past. As a whole, Latin America has its eyes on the Chinese miracle as the true paradigm of the present time: economic growth with social equity and modernity, openness to trade with internal technological development, global interdependence without ideological conditioning. Just as China did, Latin America also wants to confront the inequities arising from its own development with an ethical outlook. But the world of yesterday is changing before our eyes. Latin America needs an open world and needs to put its weight in the concert of nations so that confrontation and a world divided into blocks does not prevail. The Belt and Road Initiative represents the first time in the history of our region that a world power approaches us with respect. This is the key to sustainable and lasting cooperation. This is and has been China's policy. Latin America is part of this tradition that promotes peace, progress, and the right of people to write their own narrative of history. Thank you very much. Xixi.
Thank you, Velia. So I'm going to pass on now to Leonardo Bulamaki. Thank you.
Yes, good afternoon. Thanks for the invitation, and I'm glad to be here. When I started thinking about those themes, green transition and sharing civilizations, China and Latin America, those two words, convergence and divergence, immediately came to my mind. And I'll try to show why, at least in the case of Brazil and China, in this presentation. Okay. Okay. How do I go here? Oops. How do I go here?
Assistência técnica, por favor. Uma ajuda aqui. Assistência técnica.
Yeah. Technical assistance.
O rapaz.
Let's try here. Yeah, let me see here. Yeah. Okay. Okay, so let's try to get to this. First, let's go to the easy part, which is the convergence part. And that has to do with the green transition. Okay, convergence in the green transition is kind of easy in terms of Brazil and China. In civilization models, divergence, I think, is the word. And I used contrasting material infrastructure and political and cultural identity to arrive at. Okay, Brazil has 45% renewable energy, 80% clean electricity, so the implication is that our matrix is more or less ready for, and it's already ongoing, a sort of a green transition. And that it's very well positioned to do that if policy and investments align here and in the future. On the other hand, China is the leader in terms of investments in building clean infrastructure, including solar, wind, electrical vehicles, batteries, etc. So Brazil and China, if we look from this perspective, obviously that we have a structural complementarity in energy and in technology. And the illustration is that China needs access to what? Sustainable bioenergetic sources, which Brazil has. Diversified agricultural chains, which are resilient to climate shocks. So far, Brazil also has that. Greenfield opportunities to deploy the clean technology. Brazil also has that. On the other hand, Brazil requires a lot of infrastructure investment, which China leads the world in doing. Technology transfer, which is also easy because China is last decades, China has been leapfrogging the West in one technology after the other, so this is kind of easy to at least try to get. And a reliable export partner, which China already is in terms of Brazil. Okay, so this is already happening. In the recent years, Chinese investment, Chinese money, Chinese corporations, they came to Brazil and they are already into debt. Just to give you a quick sample of investments, those are, among many others, those are investments that are already in the works or being completed. Okay? Also, if we jump to the climate diplomacy field, then we also have sort of a more or less easy path because we have alignments in between BRICS and G77 plus China. We have a shared support for the idea of common but differentiated responsibilities. And there is also convergence in terms of emphasis in global South-led green transition. So that's sort of the easy part. When we talk about sharing civilizations, at least in terms of Brazil, we hit the hard part. We hit divergence, deep divergence. China has a Confucian inspired ethos of hierarchical harmony, collective responsibility, commitment to civilization, it's socialism, okay? Brazil, we have an amalgamation of Western liberalism, Catholic and Afro-Iberian traditions, plus more and more a pervasive individualism, which was reinforced in recent decades via the adoptions of a neoliberal ideology. So we have here diversions. Trust in the state, strong in China, weak in Brazil. Political systems and development, divergence again. China is a one-party-led political meritocracy, which is backed by a long-term vision guiding strategy, a state-led strategic planning, public funding mostly, not only, but mostly, and a cutthroat competition, Schumpeterian competition, if you will, among business that ensures sustained investment and competitiveness. Okay, as 2023, 24, manufacturing constituted almost 100%, 94% of China's total exports, investment GDP 42%. Okay, we hit Brazil. We have a sort of a plutocratic type of democracy, which means a lot of elite capture of the state. We lack long-term vision and strategy. We have, at the moment, weak state capacity and shortage of institutional coherence. And we have very high funding costs. Our interest rate is 15% per year now. And soft, if any, Schumpeterian competition, which means growth is undermined and investment and competitiveness. Agro is an exception, but is an exception that more or less confirms the rule. The rest is a completely different story. Brazil is basically a commodity exporter. And one of the reasons why agro is good is because it competes internationally and it's obliged to modernize. Okay, easy. In terms of Brazil, less than 30% of total exports were or manufacturers, and in the low end and medium and range. Investment to GDP, 18.2%. Governance and development, divergence again. China. In China, the state largely controls capital and works mostly for the public interest. China has what I call socialism with Schumpeterian characteristics. It's a long story until I got here, but I'll give you two elements of that. First, innovation and competition are very high in Chinese development strategies. If there is a theory behind China's economic development, it's Schumpeterian. It's highly Schumpeterian. And as for the institutional architecture that China possesses, it's one where the economic affairs of society belong to the public sphere and not to the private sphere. And I'm quoting Schumpeter here. It's precisely the way Schumpeter defines socialism in his 1942 book. So I would say China is socialist, and is a socialism, well, it may be with Chinese characteristics, but certainly with Schumpeterian characteristics. We hit Brazil. Capital controls the states, largely, and the states largely and mostly serve or works for special interests. Oscillation, developmental ideology or development ideology. We oscillate in between neoliberalism and a sort of a distribution focus, not production, but distribution focus kind of developmentalism. Financial interests, as we know, we Brazilians, they overrule innovation-led growth strategies. And the state largely lost its capacity to formulate and implement innovation-led growth strategies. We had a developmental state in the past. We had it, but we lost it. It's a long story again, so I'm not going to that. Civilization and strategic goals. Limits. Why? In China, China's idea of a shared future narrative is very high on China, in Asia, And in Eurasia, it also is finding more and more resonance. Brazil, this has a very limited uptake. Why? Because we're too close to the US. We have a new Monroe Doctrine in the US, and our elite vastly converted to a neoliberal ideology and policymaking. That has very little to do with a shared future. So Brazil and China, economic partnership, yes, not ideological or civilizational alignment. So, conclusion, a dual dynamics. Green convergence, yes, potentially strong, pragmatic, achievable. Civilization divergence is deep, it's structural, it's enduring. In Marxist phrasing, just for a joke, convergence below and maybe divergence above, I don't know, maybe that's an interesting one. Conclusion, again, strategic outlook. Embrace, we should embrace green transition and convergence because it's for mutual benefit. We should avoid any idea of civilization or ideological alignment. That's not in the works. And we should build a realistic framework for global South cooperation. Those are three interesting readings that helped me build this. The one that justifies the idea of China being a socialism with Trumpetian characteristics is in that paper, which is available in the web. And I thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Leonardo. So we're going to move on to the next speaker, Mr. Jansen Martins Lopes, from Petrobras.
Uma boa tarde a todos. Mais uma vez, me chamo Jansen, sou gerente aí responsável pela área de pesquisa e desenvolvimento em tecnologias voltadas para a energia. Eu trabalho no Centro, Centro de Pesquisas da Petrobras, aqui no Rio de Janeiro. Agradeço mais uma vez o convite, é uma honra estar participando aqui com vocês e tendo a oportunidade de compartilhar um pouquinho o que nós temos desenvolvido no campo da transição energética e, mais especificamente, em temas relacionados à geração renovável e como isso conversa com a indústria de óleo e gás, como que a gente enxerga a aplicação dessas tecnologias na nossa indústria. Antes de passar propriamente dito, deixa eu ver se vai funcionar aqui. Opa! Vamos lá. Antes de entrar, propriamente dito, no nosso portfólio, que é a ideia aqui de compartilhar com vocês, eu quero mostrar aqui nesse slide, enquanto ele carrega, vamos lá, como que estão agrupados hoje as grandes linhas de pesquisa no Centro de Pesquisas da Petrobras, né? Basicamente, passou demais, vamos lá. Basicamente, nós definimos ali 18 áreas estratégicas, né, que realmente nós entendemos que a gente precisa concentrar esforços, né, e dedicar recursos de pesquisa e desenvolvimento. E se vocês observarem nessa seta, né, no centro da tela, a gente dividiu essas linhas estratégicas em 3 grandes grupos, digamos assim, algumas voltadas para a otimização dos nossos ativos atuais, né? Isso basicamente porque nós somos, né, uma indústria de óleo e gás, nós temos muitos ativos em operação atualmente, e a gente entende que sim, é importante manter a operação dessas unidades até como uma forma de contribuir para a transição energética justa, no sentido de que a indústria ela tem esse papel relevante, né, de custear, enfim, de financiar essa transição energética para que ela de fato seja justa. Então a gente precisa cuidar dos ativos atuais, e cuidar deles sob a ótica da tecnologia significa contribuir para que eles operem na máxima eficiência possível e, no fim do dia, isso representa também redução de emissões. Então, esse é um aspecto importante e aí tem uma série de linhas de pesquisa direcionadas a esse objetivo. Quando a gente olha um pouquinho mais para o meio ali da seta, a gente já enxerga ali o Oil and Gas of the Future. Aqui o ponto é o seguinte, nós temos um compromisso público, né, assim como diversas companhias, de atingir ali 0 emissões operacionais em 2050. Então, a gente não pode imaginar em estar concebendo hoje uma plataforma, por exemplo, que vai estar iniciando uma operação lá em 2050, sem que a gente altere todo o conceito dessa unidade para que ela, de fato, seja uma unidade net zero. Então, hoje tem um grupo grande, né, de pesquisadores engajados em diversas linhas voltadas para conceber essas novas unidades, né? São as unidades do futuro, né? Unidades em que a gente já vai estar em uma realidade net zero e a gente precisa estar preparado, precisa desenvolver as tecnologias que vão suportar essas operações. E quando a gente vai ali mais para o finalzinho, a gente já viu o New Business. Aí sim, de fato, os temas relacionados já à transição energética, né, como geração renovável, tanto eólica quanto solar, armazenamento de energia, hidrogênio de baixo carbono, enfim, as temáticas que são super relevantes e que contribuem aí para a descarbonização da sociedade como um todo. E aí eu queria fazer um destaque aqui para vocês. Atualmente, esse grupo de iniciativas tecnológicas, está aparecendo ali uma caixinha preta na frente, mas ela representa em torno de 15% do nosso orçamento anual de pesquisa e desenvolvimento, esse grupo de temas, né, que estão ali voltados para a transição energética. E a gente tem também aí um compromisso público de atingir 30% da nossa carteira, né, de investimentos em P&D em 2029, especificamente nesse grupo de projetos. Então, de fato, a gente tem investido cada vez mais e ampliado os times que têm concentrado esforços nesses temas, que é um tema realmente assim, super crítico para a companhia. E aí, entrando mais no detalhe do portfólio de P&D em energias, aí vamos falar um pouquinho de algumas tecnologias aqui, só dar uma pincelada para vocês, começando aqui pelas atividades que a gente desempenha aqui em terra, né, no onshore. Então, por exemplo, nós temos iniciativas voltadas para a geração solar. Então, hoje, nós já temos alguns projetos em andamento de implantação de parques solares, né, usinas solares, integradas aos nossos ativos de refino. Né, e como que isso contribui com as nossas operações? A gente tem a possibilidade de utilizar essa energia gerada ao longo do dia para reduzir, de alguma forma, o nosso consumo de gás na geração de energia dessas refinarias. Então, a nossa intenção é que a gente amplie, né, a participação dessa geração solar nos nossos parques de refino e outras plantas em terra também, comunidades de processamento de gás, como uma forma também de contribuir com a nossa redução de pegada de carbono. Um segundo item ali que eu trouxe para destaque, só que para mencionar que a gente também trabalha com algumas tecnologias mais disruptivas. Então, a gente estuda, por exemplo, a perovskita, que é uma tecnologia um pouco mais disruptiva também de geração solar e que é um material diferente do material atualmente utilizado nos painéis fotovoltaicos e que tem ali um potencial muito grande por conta da possibilidade da gente aplicar essa tecnologia em superfícies que não sejam planas. Então, aumenta ali o leque de possibilidade de aplicação desse tipo de geração. Passando aqui para a parte de armazenamento de energia, eu ouvi também em alguma das sessões aqui alguém comentando sobre, né, a participação da geração renovável no grid brasileiro, que em alguns momentos já atinge aí 90%, né, composto basicamente pela geração hidroelétrica, solar e eólica. E aí, junto da geração solar e eólica, vem o desafio da intermitência, né? Então, hoje o setor elétrico brasileiro já vive ali alguns desafios relacionados a isso. Obviamente, a gente tem a geração solar ao longo do dia, né, na luz do dia. Então, já tem uma oscilação intraday ali, né, relacionada a essa tecnologia. E em relação à geração eólica, a gente tem ali a variabilidade ao longo das estações do ano, enfim, um espaçamento um pouco maior. E aí, o armazenamento de energia é uma tecnologia que vem realmente aí ganhando força, tendo um papel ali muito importante de armazenar o excesso ali da energia que é gerada em algum momento do dia, que a gente tem baixa demanda, para que a gente consiga utilizar, então, essa energia que é renovável, está ali armazenada, nos momentos de pico de demanda. Passando um pouquinho aqui para nossas usinas termoelétricas, gas power plants. Então, hoje a Petrobras ela conta com 13 usinas termoelétricas operadas a gás. E essas usinas, a gente tem, então, obviamente, também um desafio de torná-las net zero, né, até 2050, e a gente tem algumas linhas voltadas, né, para a descarbonização dessas operações, dessas usinas. E falando um pouquinho de eólica onshore, acho que o principal destaque que eu queria compartilhar com vocês é o desenvolvimento de um aerogerador de alta capacidade onshore, em parceria com a VEG, uma empresa nacional aí da indústria de energia. É um equipamento que já está em fase de comissionamento, em breve deve entrar aí em operação e passar por um processo de certificação. Também a gente contribuindo aí com a indústria e com a possibilidade de implantação de máquinas de maior porte aqui na geração eólica onshore no Brasil. E indo um pouquinho agora para o oceano, ali para o offshore, o primeiro destaque que eu trago é na parte de eletrificação das nossas operações de exploração e produção. Eu costumo dizer internamente que não existe a possibilidade de a gente falar em descarbonizar as nossas operações de EIP, de exploração e produção, sem falar em eletrificar as nossas plataformas, porque 70% da emissão de CO2 dessas plataformas vem do sistema de geração de energia, porque nós queimamos gás combustível nesses sistemas. E aí a gente tem ali uma série de rotas possíveis, e isso conversa muito, tanto com a possibilidade de conectar com o sistema interligado nacional, que é o que a gente chama de Power from Shore, buscar ali meios, e desenvolver tecnologia para conectar o nosso grid aos nossos sistemas de produção em alto mar, mas também a possibilidade de integração com sistemas eólicos, tanto flutuantes, e aí já, no caso de flutuante, a bastante longo prazo, porque é uma tecnologia que ainda está amadurecendo, não só aqui, mas mundo afora também, mas também nas eventuais parques comerciais eólicos em lâmina d'água rasa, que ainda não é uma realidade aqui no Brasil, é uma realidade mundo afora, e a China se destaca muito nisso, dada a sua capacidade instalada e a sua geração atual eólica offshore, mas estudos já indicam que o Brasil tem um potencial bastante relevante para a geração eólica offshore em lâmina d'água rasa, e o que a gente tem investido muito recentemente é na caracterização dessas regiões. Então, hoje existem dados de simulação, dados computacionais, e a gente está investido em projetos em que a gente posiciona determinados equipamentos no mar, nas regiões que são consideradas ali as de maior potencial, para que a gente colete esses dados reais e consiga subsidiar as discussões internas, o planejamento aí de eventuais projetos futuros nesse segmento, e aí tanto para a geração de energia como um negócio, mas também fazendo um link aqui para a descarbonização das nossas operações. Então, assim, em 5 minutinhos aqui foi o que eu consegui passar para vocês um overview do portfólio. A gente tem diversos outros temas, mas eu queria aproveitar, antes de terminar, rapidamente aqui, eu vou deixar também esse material disponível, mas nesses 3 QR Codes vocês conseguem acessar ali mais informações sobre os projetos. No caso da esquerda, a gente mostra todo o nosso portfólio de projetos de P&D que utilizam recursos da verba de obrigação da ANEEL. Ali no meio, o projeto nosso da Boia Bravo, que é uma dessas boias que está fazendo aquisição de dados em tempo real atualmente, e o terceiro do nosso aerogerador desenvolvido com a VEG. Mas eu queria compartilhar também com vocês o Conexões para a Inovação. Essa é a forma como a Petrobras desenhou o modo como a gente interage com o mercado, interage com a academia, interage com startups. Então, existem diversas, digamos assim, portas de entrada para a Petrobras estar interagindo tanto com o meio acadêmico, como a indústria e outras instituições de ciência e tecnologia. Esse QR Code aqui leva a essa página do Conexões para a Inovação. E todo esse desenvolvimento a gente não faz nada sozinho. Tem um número interessante para vocês. Nós temos no Centro de Pesquisa em torno de 1000 pesquisadores. E quando a gente considera todo o grupo de pesquisadores engajados nos projetos e que fazem parte dessas instituições parceiras, a gente atinge um total de 10.000 pessoas. Então, a gente não desenvolve nada sozinho, a gente tem assim, parcerias com universidades aqui no Brasil, fora do país, empresas, startups. E aí eu queria também aproveitar esse momento aqui, deixar um convite para vocês que acessem lá o Conexões para a Inovação. A gente está super aberto a dialogar, enfim, a gente tem interagido bastante com empresas chinesas também, dada até a relevância da China no desenvolvimento de aerogeradores ali offshore e em outras áreas também. Então, fica aí o convite para todo mundo, quem tiver a possibilidade de acessar, e a gente poder conversar um pouquinho e seguir juntos aí no desafio da transição energética. Muito obrigado.
Obrigado, Jansen. Pass now on to Zheng Bingjian.
尊敬的我用中文了啊。尊敬的各位专家学者，大家好。今天我非常荣幸能够在这里和大家一起共同探讨以合作谋求发展，这样一个重要而有意义的课题。要感谢组织者刘金龙教授给予我这次演讲的机会。我和刘金龙教授是同事，非常支持他举办这次研讨会。对于我的这次演讲呢，更像是一个工作的倡议。首先我想向大家介绍一下中国人民大学对外合作办公室的主要职能。对外合作办公室呢，作为中国人民大学 对外合作委员会的一个常设的办事机构，肩负着人民大学对外合作与拓展战略规划的一个重任。它不仅肩负着设计起草和人民大学对外合作的这个协议，还承担着协调推进督促我们人民大学对外合作的各项的任务。此外呢，我们还致力于建立健全对外合作效果的评价落实机制，全方位的推动人民大学对外合作事业的顺利发展。在人民大学推进生态文明研究的发展方面呢，人民大学一直不遗余力。我呢和刘金龙教授原来是同事，我曾担任中国人民大学农业与农村发展学院党委书记。在此期间，我也深刻认识到生态文明建设对于我国可持续发展的重要意义。因此，在学院期间，我也是非常的支持开展生态文明方面的研究。我们学院也是一直致力于相关领域的研究，积累了丰富的经验和数据。我也非常愿意与中国境内的各个领域的高校，因为我看到这次参加会议的有我们中国的很多同事，开展的研究合作，甚至一些中国的企业开展合作。通过我们沟通联络各方面的资源，可以为生态文明的研究提供坚实的研究基础，共同探索生态文明建设的新路径，新的模式。我也相信，通过我们的共同努力，一定能够在生态文明研究领域取得突破性的成果，为中国的生态文明建设贡献智慧和力量。同时，我也深知生态文明问题是一个全球性的问题，需要我们国际社会的共同努力，包括我们国际上的所有的专家学者。在此，我也更愿意将我们的对外合作延伸到国际层面。我也衷心的欢迎国际领域的专家学者、公司机构都能够参与到我们的合作中来。通过这样的对话与交流，我们可以碰撞出更多的思想火花，共同推动生态文明研究在国际上形成强大的声音。让我们携手合作，共同为构建一个更加美好的生态文明世界而努力。最后我想表达的是，我们这次研讨会得到了中国人民大学党委书记、校长的大力支持。因此呢，我们中国人民大学的党委书记张东刚教授，大约10分钟之后也会到达现场吧，10到15分钟左右，为我们的会议做一个闭幕词。我想刘金龙教授跟我的想法可能是一样的，我就做一个简单的倡议，谢谢。
Obrigado. Thank you. I think we have time now for a couple of questions.
Boa tarde, meu nome é Luiz Henrique, eu estou aqui pela UFMG e pela RUC, University of China. Eu gostaria de fazer uma pergunta para o palestrante, né, sobre a Petrobras. Na verdade, é algo que não está na minha pesquisa, que eu coloquei como limitações da minha pesquisa. E eu queria saber como que a Petrobras lida, por exemplo, com as questões das energias renováveis, pensando que as energias fósseis, elas estão na base de todas, elas ainda são as energias que propulsionam as outras energias também, principalmente as renováveis, que para as torres das turbinas eólicas, por exemplo, não é a questão da energia, mas a quantidade de água que gasta para o concreto da base das turbinas, certo? Esse tipo de preocupação, como é que passa pela questão da inovação da Petrobras, como que passa por discussões que falam em zerar o uso de energias fósseis, que a gente sabe não tem como zerar, né? Tem como diminuir, tem como associar com outras energias. Esse tipo de pergunta que eu gostaria de fazer e gostaria de saber como que a Petrobras tem lidado com esse tipo de assunto. Obrigado.
Olá, boa noite. Bom, vocês sabem, meu nome é Ana Célia Castro, eu sou diretora aqui do Colégio Brasileiro de Altos Estudos. Eu queria fazer uma uma pergunta ao Leonardo, mas que, na verdade, serve a todos. Eu acho que foi muito bem colocada a questão da convergência no plano das ações e da sustentabilidade, enfim, do nosso futuro comum. E também a divergência, não só das tradições culturais, mas mais do processo civilizatório. E eu gostaria de saber se é possível pensar em encaminhar para uma menor divergência ou para um caminho de convergência entre as nossas civilizações.
Tudo bem, vamos lá. Então, respondendo à primeira pergunta, desculpa, como é seu nome? Luiz. Obrigado, Luiz, pela pergunta. De fato, a gente enxerga realmente uma continuidade ainda, né, da produção do petróleo, como eu comentei até um pouquinho aqui na minha apresentação. A gente vê essa relevância por conta da demanda propriamente dita, mas também como um papel extremamente relevante para garantir que essa transição ela seja justa, né, no momento em que a gente ainda tem perspectiva de atingir um pico de demanda global pelo óleo e gás. Se a gente vai por um caminho de simplesmente cortar, né, essa fonte de energia, a gente naturalmente vai estar levando toda a sociedade para uma transição que talvez não seja justa no sentido de acesso à energia. Então, essa é uma preocupação muito grande que a gente tem, até do ponto de vista social aqui, né, com o Brasil, e que a gente continue, né, a produção, obviamente, a gente acredita nisso, e que, de certa forma, essa produção ela subsidia um pouco essa transição, né? Não à toa a gente tem, né, já direcionado alguns esforços e investimentos na parte de renováveis, e aí a gente tem uma robusta carteira de pesquisa e desenvolvimento, que aí são projetos, né, já mirando mais ali a médio e longo prazo, mas no nosso plano de negócios, enfim, é público, também já existe ali uma parcela do CAPEX, né, do investimento da companhia, voltado para a implantação de negócios renováveis. Então, cada vez mais, né, vocês vão estar observando, né, uma participação de renováveis nos negócios da Petrobras, e de forma gradual, né, sem ser de forma assodada, para que ela seja justa. E com relação à questão de consumo de água e até da responsabilidade na execução dos projetos, na construção dos nossos ativos, acabou que eu não abordei aqui, mas a gente tem ali um grupo de projetos também, um portfólio totalmente dedicado para a parte de sustentabilidade, né? Então, ali é um grupo de projetos onde a gente olha, por exemplo, como minimizar o consumo de água ou tornar, eventualmente, as nossas operações água positiva, digamos assim, né? Sem que a gente necessite captar a água dos recursos naturais para realizar as nossas operações. Então, essa é uma das frentes. Outra frente é toda a parte relacionada à economia circular, né, para que a gente dê ali uma correta destinação e reutilize, eventualmente, peças e equipamentos que tenham concluído ali a sua vida útil para uma determinada operação, como que a gente retorna isso, né, ali para o ciclo industrial e para a sociedade, minimizando ali a geração de resíduo. Então, esses são alguns exemplos de iniciativas que nós temos. Fico aberto aí, depois a gente pode conversar um pouquinho mais, né, para trazer mais exemplos para vocês. Tá bom? Obrigado.
Ana Celia's questions was directed to everyone, so
In what language? English? English. Okay, I'll do it in English because it's easier for everyone. Well, I think the question is crucial, but it's also extremely difficult to answer, because what you said, is it possible to diminish the divergence that is now, I think, exploding in between the West and Eurasia, and China being at the very center of this new Eurasian order that it's in the making, or is already very much advanced in its build-up? It is possible, but I don't think it's likely at the moment, because we're in a world which is extremely polarized, and there are no signs that this polarization is going to get better, at least in the short to medium run. Brazil specifically is relatively, on one hand, is relatively well positioned to get along better with, let's say, the Sinocentric Eurasian order. Why? Because we had a tradition of state planning, of a developmental state, of a technocratic culture in terms of technocrats backing development. And, well, in terms of culture, we are, I think, kind of very flexible. We can adapt well. This is on one side. So our past is favorable. Our recent past and our present are not. Why? Because we had a huge turn to neoliberalism here with Fernando Collor, Fernando Henrique Cardoso, and then it was not really dismantled by the Lula administrations. And this, I think, introduced a very deep divide that made our elites very much into debt. Now we have the financial elites which are very much into the state. They capture the state, and they are not favorable to any of that. So it depends very much. Brazil is also very well positioned in terms of being one of the founding members of the BRICS. But let's see what's going to happen in that meeting that is just starting. Let's see what kind of behavior Brazilian diplomacy and what's exactly is going to happen, because this is crucial in terms of positioning itself as a country. So, you know, in a way, we have the potential to do it. But it would be, I think, very difficult to overcome the political obstacles in terms of what kind of political coalition do we have in place? What kind of, we have a plutocratic democracy. We don't have a real democracy nowadays here. We have a plutocratic democracy. And how do we overcome this in terms of bringing more preoccupation with the public interest? We don't have that. So we would need that to craft a better, let's say, convergent path with, let's say, the idea of a shared civilization, shared civilization, with what I see coming from the East, especially from China. So it's a hard bet. Okay.
Does any of the speakers want to complement? We are already 10 minutes behind schedule, so unless anyone has some burning issues, we can end the session and move on to the closing ceremony, if no one objects. Okay, so thank you everyone.